Samantha was a well-liked college student with a steady job, close friends, and a future wide open until a chance encounter on campus set off a chilling chain of events. Do not forget to write in the comments where and when you are watching us on this mysterious journey, and subscribe for more unsolved events. The trajectory of what would become a 13-year ordeal began in a setting typically associated with safety and community fellowship. Samantha Stites, a college student characterized by her outgoing and polite nature, attended a meeting of a Christian organization on her campus. It was in this environment, designed to foster like-minded connections, that she first encountered Christopher Thomas. He was not immediately perceived as a threat, but rather as an awkward acquaintance, someone who appeared uncomfortable in social group settings. He exhibited behaviors such as avoiding eye contact, looking downward during interactions, and having difficulty sustaining conversations beyond basic introductory questions. Samantha, operating under typical social norms of inclusion, attempted to be friendly to an individual who seemed isolated. There were no immediate red flags that indicated dangerous potential. His demeanor was interpreted solely as social awkwardness, rather than the precursor to obsessive fixation. The transition from casual acquaintance to targeted individual manifested with a specific physical object placed in Samantha's personal domain. Following her internship at Grand Valley State, she returned to her vehicle to discover a single red rose. At that juncture, not many individuals were aware of her internship location, as she had only recently commenced her position there. Initially, Samantha viewed the anonymous gift with a degree of curiosity, entertaining the possibility that it might be from someone in whom she arguably had a romantic interest. She engaged in a brief investigative process, contacting various friends and acquaintances to identify the sender. After several days of inquiry without result, she eventually looped back to Christopher Thomas. Upon being asked, he initially denied involvement, but subsequently admitted that he had indeed left the rose. More alarmingly, he revealed the methodology used to deliver it. He had followed her from her residence to her new internship location, thereby ascertaining her daily route and destination without her knowledge. This admission marked the first definitive breach of privacy. Samantha's internal reaction was one of unease. Recognizing that following someone to their place of employment was outside the bounds of normal social interaction, she communicated her lack of romantic interest to him over the telephone, explicitly requesting that he not ask her out. Despite this direct rejection, Christopher maintained a pattern of persistent contact. He utilized various messaging platforms, such as text messages and Facebook, to continue his pursuit. His communication style often oscillated between innocuous inquiries about her day and more intense, religiously framed overtures that attempted to contextualize a potential relationship through Bible verses. This persisted even after Samantha took the digital preventative measure of blocking his phone number. He simply shifted his primary mode of communication to other open channels, such as Facebook, where he would wait a few days after being ignored before sending a fresh, casually worded message as if no prior conflict had occurred. The stalking behavior soon escalated from digital communication and occasional gifts to persistent physical proximity. Christopher began to appear with increasing frequency in locations where Samantha was present. In the collegiate environment, this initially appeared as passing encounters in hallways on the way to classes. However, the frequency of these encounters increased from bi-weekly to weekly, and the locations became more varied and personal. He was observed at her gym, often already actively running on a treadmill when she arrived, suggesting he may have spent extended periods waiting for her to appear. He was seen wandering the aisles of the grocery store she patronized, and was even spotted at bars she attended with friends. This omnipresence led Samantha and her social circle to suspect the presence of a tracking device on her vehicle. although their initial manual searches of the car yielded no physical evidence of such a device at that time. The relentless nature of this surveillance began to exert a psychological toll. Although Samantha attempted to rationalize it as a temporary annoyance, she just needed to outlast until graduation. The stalking extended beyond her immediate person. It was later revealed that Christopher had utilized technology to track not just Samantha, but also her associates. He admitted, much later during the abduction event, that he had placed tracking devices on the vehicles of her roommate and other friends. The stated purpose of this extended surveillance network was to maintain a constant awareness of who Samantha was with and what activities she was engaged in, thereby allowing him to insert himself into her vicinity with presumed coincidence. After 3 years of this escalating behavior, Samantha sought legal recourse in the form of a personal protection order. The court granted this order, effectively mandating that Christopher Thomas maintain a specified distance or face arrest. Following the completion of her degree, Samantha relocated to Traverse City, a move that ostensibly should have provided a geographic buffer and a fresh start free from his harassment. For a period of approximately 6 years, this appeared to be effective. However, as the personal protection order neared its expiration date, Christopher Thomas also relocated to Traverse City. The pattern of stalking recommenced in this new location with the same intensity as before. Samantha was shocked to discover his presence at an adult recreation league soccer field where she was playing. Once again, he began appearing at her gym and in local grocery stores, proving that the relocation had not deterred his fixation. Faced with this renewed threat, Samantha consulted with a teammate who was an assistant prosecutor to explore the possibility of filing a second personal protection order. The judicial system, however, presented a procedural obstacle. The court denied an ex parte order, which would have allowed the judge to grant the protection based solely on Samantha's testimony without Christopher present. Instead, the court required a full hearing where Christopher would be in attendance, fearing that dragging him into court might further agitate an already unstable individual, and wary of letting him know she was legally maneuvering against him again. Samantha made the difficult tactical decision not to pursue the renewal of the order, hoping instead to manage the situation through continued vigilance. On a cold Friday morning in October, the long-standing pattern of stalking escalated into a direct and violent physical confrontation. Samantha was in her residence, still in bed, after her roommate had already departed for work. In the quiet of the house, she heard a distinct creak of the wood flooring, familiar with the auditory signatures of her own home. She recognized the sound as being indicative of human weight rather than typical house settling or pet movement. Assuming it might be her roommate returning for a forgotten item, she called out her roommate's name. There was no verbal response, and silence followed the initial creak. Realizing that an unresponsive individual was likely positioned just outside her bedroom door, Samantha was faced with a critical decision in a matter of seconds. She possessed a hatchet kept under her bed for self-defense purposes. However, in the disorientation of just waking up and bundled in her bed, she calculated that introducing a lethal weapon into a situation where she was likely physically outmatched and unprepared might be more dangerous than helpful. Instead of reaching for the hatchet, she reached for her bedside lamp to illuminate the room and identify the intruder. At that precise moment, the bedroom door was flung open. Christopher Thomas entered the room and immediately jumped onto Samantha while she was still in her bed. As she began to scream, he applied pressure to her throat with his hands, effectively choking her to cease the noise. The immediate physical assault transitioned into a methodical process of restraint. He utilized handcuffs to secure her wrists and inserted a ball gag into her mouth, which was then secured with duct tape. Further duct tape was applied to bind her feet, rendering her immobile. To complete the sensory deprivation, he placed a blindfold over her eyes. During this initial assault, Samantha's cognitive processing shifted to survival statistics. She was aware that the likelihood of surviving an abduction decreases significantly if the victim is transported from the primary crime scene to a secondary location. Despite this knowledge, she was physically unable to prevent Christopher from moving her. He informed her that he was taking her to a location she knew. He then loaded her into her own vehicle for transport. Although blindfolded, Samantha attempted to maintain spatial awareness by counting the turns the vehicle made, hoping to establish a mental map of their destination in the event of an escape. Opportunity *, the transport period was relatively short, ending at a location approximately 1/4 of a mile from her residence. While still blindfolded, she could hear the distinct sound of a garage door operating. She was led through to low thresholds, indicating movement into a nested structure. It was only later revealed that Christopher had brought her to a storage unit where he had meticulously constructed a soundproof bunker specifically for the purpose of holding her captive. Once inside this prepared environment, Christopher chained Samantha to the wall. He then left her temporarily secured in the bunker while he took her vehicle to a local home improvement store parking lot, believed to be This action was presumably intended to create a false narrative regarding her disappearance, potentially suggesting she had been abducted while running errands rather than from her home. He then returned to the storage unit on foot. Inside the bunker, Christopher began to reveal the extent of his planning. He explicitly told Samantha that he had been inspired by a streaming television series titled You, which features a protagonist who stalks and holds victims captive in a glass cage. He displayed his phone to her, showing the active tracking software he had been using to monitor her movements for an extended period. He outlined his intention to keep her in the bunker for a period of 2 weeks. At the conclusion of this 2-week period, his stated plan was to kill her and dispose of her body in Lake Michigan, potentially staging the scene to look like an accidental drowning, for which he had planned to leave her paddleboard on the beach. Faced with the explicitly stated timeline of her own impending death, Samantha relied on her professional training as a social worker and therapist to engage her captor. Recognizing that physical escape was currently impossible due to the chains and the secure nature of the bunker, she adopted a strategy of psychological de-escalation. She utilized motivational interviewing techniques, speaking to him in a calm, non-confrontational manner designed to build a tentative rapport. She sought to understand his immediate motivations and fears. Through this dialogue, she discerned that, alongside his obsession with her, he possessed a significant fear of incarceration. Seizing on this fear, Samantha began to negotiate for her life. She offered a transactional arrangement that she believed would appeal to his obsessive desires, while simultaneously alleviating his fear of legal consequences. She proposed that if he agreed to release her, she would not report the abduction to law enforcement. Furthermore, she promised that they could maintain a friendship going forward. To seal this desperate agreement and to convince him of her sincerity, she realized she had to offer him the one thing his stalking had always been oriented towards. She engaged in sexual activity with him as the requisite price for her promised release. This calculated decision was made under extreme duress, as the only viable course of action was to accede to his demands. Following this event, Christopher Thomas upheld his portion of the negotiated agreement. He unchained Samantha from the wall and prepared her for departure from the soundproofed bunker. She was once again placed in her own vehicle, which he had retrieved from the home improvement store parking lot, and he drove her back to that same location. The exchange concluded with him leaving her with her car, presumably under the belief that their coerced pact would be honored, and he would face no legal repercussions for the hours of terror he had inflicted. immediately upon being left alone. Samantha did not proceed to her home or directly to a police station. Her methodical thinking, which had been instrumental to her survival within the bunker, continued to guide her actions in the immediate aftermath of her release. She operated under the correct assumption that the tracking device Christopher had shown her on his phone was still active and affixed to her vehicle. Driving to a sensitive location like her residence or a law enforcement facility would have alerted him to her movements and her intentions, potentially provoking a further and likely more violent response. Her priority was to separate herself from the compromised vehicle and establish a secure line of communication without his knowledge. She drove to a neutral, public location and locked herself inside a bathroom. From this secure space, she made a critical phone call. The recipient was not a close friend or family member, as she knew Christopher was aware of her primary social circle and might have been monitoring their activities as well. Instead, she contacted a co-worker who was also a neighbor and a registered nurse. This individual was chosen for her professional medical knowledge, her proximity, and her relative anonymity to the perpetrator. She explained the situation, and her friend agreed to meet her and transport her to a hospital. Upon her friend's arrival, they proceeded to a local medical facility. The primary purpose of this visit was twofold: to receive a medical evaluation for any injuries sustained during the abduction and assault, and, critically, to undergo a sexual assault forensic examination, commonly known as a rape kit. This procedure was essential for the collection of DNA and other trace evidence that could legally connect Christopher Thomas to the crimes. Nurses at the hospital initiated the protocol, which involves a meticulous and documented collection of biological samples and other physical evidence from the victim's body and clothing. Concurrently, she was administered precautionary medications for sexually transmitted infections while this examination was being conducted, and in accordance with standard medical and legal protocols for such cases, hospital staff contacted the police. Law enforcement officers arrived at the hospital to interview Samantha. Despite the significant trauma she had just endured, she was able to provide a coherent and detailed account of the events. She identified Christopher Thomas by name as her assailant and long-term stalker. She provided the officers with the approximate location of the storage unit, based on the mental map she had constructed by counting turns during her transport. She described the interior of the unit in detail, including the purpose-built soundproofed bunker, the presence of chains attached to the wall, and the general layout of the structure he had built. Her clear and specific testimony provided the police with immediate and actionable intelligence. Based on the gravity of her statement, the police department mobilized a rapid and significant response. A search was immediately initiated for the storage facility she had described. Simultaneously, an alert was issued for the arrest of Christopher Thomas. Patrol units were dispatched to the area Samantha had indicated, and they quickly located a storage complex that matched her description. Given the potential for the suspect to still be on site, or for the unit to be booby-trapped, a tactical approach was employed. Officers, including a canine unit, were brought in to secure the perimeter and make entry into the specific unit that was registered to Christopher Thomas, upon forcing entry into the storage unit. The officers found that Samantha's description was entirely accurate. They discovered the nested room within the larger storage space, constructed with soundproofing materials. Inside this bunker, they located the physical evidence that corroborated her story, including the chains affixed to the wall where she had been restrained. The scene was immediately secured as a major crime scene, and forensic investigators were called in to process the location for evidence. The discovery of this meticulously prepared abduction cell provided undeniable physical confirmation of Samantha's account and transformed the investigation from a report of an assault into a manhunt for a kidnapper who who had engaged in extensive and sophisticated premeditation. The search for Christopher Thomas intensified, with law enforcement now in possession of not only a victim's testimony, but also a crime scene that illustrated the extreme and calculated nature of the threat he posed. Asterisk. With the crime scene at the storage unit secured and being processed by forensic teams, the full weight of the investigation shifted to locating and apprehending Christopher Thomas. The information provided by Samantha was cross-referenced with public and law enforcement databases, quickly yielding his residential address. Within a matter of hours following Samantha's initial report from the hospital, officers converged on his apartment to execute a search warrant and take him into custody. He was arrested without incident, a stark contrast to the violent and calculated nature of his crimes. Asterisk. The search of his residence provided investigators with a wealth of corroborating evidence. Unlike many offenders who attempt to dispose of incriminating items, Thomas had retained numerous articles connected to the abduction. Inside his apartment, police found the sheets that had been on the bed inside the storage unit bunker. They also located the ball gag and the roll of duct tape that had been used to bind and silence Samantha. The discovery of these items in his personal living space directly linked him to the materials used in the commission of the crime, effectively eliminating any ambiguity about his involvement. The collection of this physical evidence from both the storage unit and his home began to construct an irrefutable case against him. Asterisk. Once in custody, Christopher Thomas was subjected to a formal interrogation. His initial statements to detectives were characterized by a series of denials and fabrications, designed to deflect blame and minimize his culpability. His first explanation for his actions on the day of the abduction was that he had been hunting, an alibi that was quickly dismantled by the evidence already collected. When the interrogating officers confronted him with the fact that they had surveillance footage of him at the storage unit with Samantha, and that they had already been inside the bunker he had constructed, his story shifted. Asterisk. His second narrative was an attempt to reframe the kidnapping and assault as a consensual act of roleplay. He claimed that the entire event was a prearranged fantasy that he had surprised Samantha with, and that her negative reaction was simply an expression of her not being happy with the surprise. This explanation was patently absurd in the face of the evidence and Samantha's testimony. It demonstrated a profound disconnect from the reality of his actions and the terror he had inflicted. His assertion that her lack of enjoyment was the central issue, rather than the violent and non-consensual nature of the abduction, provided a chilling insight into his psychological state and his complete lack of remorse or understanding of the severity of his offenses. Asterisk. The investigation continued to compile evidence from various sources. The rape kit performed at the hospital yielded DNA evidence that would later be matched to Christopher Thomas. Investigators retrieved tracking data from his phone and other electronic devices, which documented his long-term surveillance of Samantha's movements. They also collected financial records that showed the purchases of materials used to construct the bunker, such as soundproofing, foam, and building supplies, further demonstrating the extensive premeditation involved. The collective evidence painted a clear picture of a years-long obsession that had culminated in a meticulously planned kidnapping and sexual assault. Asterisk. Initially, Christopher Thomas pleaded not guilty to the charges brought against him, which included kidnapping, home invasion, and multiple counts of criminal sexual conduct. His defense team appeared poised to contest the charges in a full trial. However, as the trial date approached and the mountain of physical and digital evidence against him became fully apparent, his position changed. Faced with the certainty of a conviction on all counts if the case went before a jury, he opted to accept a plea agreement offered by the prosecution. Asterisk. The terms of the plea deal involved him pleading guilty to the charge of kidnapping. In exchange for this plea, the prosecution agreed to drop the separate charges of home invasion and criminal sexual conduct. while this meant he would not be formally convicted of the sexual assault. The kidnapping charge itself carried a substantial penalty. The plea agreement averted the need for a traumatic public trial for Samantha, and secured a guaranteed conviction and a long-term prison sentence for her attacker. In court, during his plea, he was required to affirm the factual basis of his crime, formally admitting to the act of kidnapping and acknowledging the severe mental pain his actions had caused his victim. His clinical, detached responses in the courtroom mirrored the cold, calculated nature of his long-running obsession and the final, violent execution of his plan. Asterisk. The acceptance of the plea agreement by the court represented a significant procedural pivot, shifting the legal focus from the determination of guilt to the quantification of punishment. With Christopher Thomas's admission of kidnapping formally entered into the record, the adversarial nature of a trial was replaced by the administrative and evaluative processes that precede sentencing. This phase of the judicial timeline is methodical and heavily reliant on documentary evidence, designed to provide the sentencing judge with a comprehensive and ostensibly objective framework from which to determine an appropriate and legally defensible term of incarceration. The central document in this process is the Pre-Sentence Investigation Report, or PSI, a comprehensive dossier compiled by the state's Department of Corrections or a designated probation officer. Asterisk, the compilation of Christopher Thomas's PSI involved an extensive background investigation. The probation officer tasked with its creation gathered information from a wide array of sources, including educational records, employment histories, and interviews with individuals who may have known him, although the latter is often limited in cases involving individuals who lead isolated lives. The report methodically catalogued his personal history, likely noting any details regarding his upbringing, family dynamics, and social development that could be officially verified. It would have included a formal summary of his academic performance and a record of his employment, which, by all public accounts, was stable. A crucial section of the PSI is dedicated to the defendant's prior criminal history, or lack thereof. In Thomas's case, the absence of a significant or violent criminal record prior to the abduction would have been a noted factor, presenting the court with the complex portrait of an individual who, on paper, did not fit the typical profile of a violent felon, yet had committed an act of extreme, calculated violence. Asterisk. Furthermore, the PSI contains the official version of the offense, a narrative constructed from police reports, investigative findings, and the defendant's own statement, if one was provided. This section would have detailed the 13-year history of stalking, the meticulous construction of the soundproof bunker, the methods of restraint used, and the explicit threats made against Samantha's life. It served to codify the crime not as a singular, impulsive act, but as the culmination of a long-term, obsessive project. This report, once completed, was submitted to the judge, the prosecuting attorney, and the defense counsel for review prior to the sentencing hearing, becoming the foundational text upon which the final legal arguments would be built. Asterisk. Concurrent with the preparation of the PSI, Samantha was afforded the opportunity to contribute her own formal document to the court proceedings, the Victim Impact Statement. This is a legally recognized mechanism that allows a victim to articulate the consequences of the crime directly to the judicial system. It is not intended to be an emotional appeal, but rather a factual recitation of the harm inflicted, covering physical, psychological, financial, and social dimensions. Samantha's statement, whether delivered in writing or read aloud in court, would have provided a harrowing but necessary counterpoint to the clinical, bureaucratic language of the other legal documents. Asterisk. In her statement, she detailed the profound and lasting effects of the ordeal. She formally notified the court of her diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition characterized by symptoms she was now forced to manage daily. These included severe difficulty sleeping, a persistent state of hypervigilance, and a recurring fear of being alone, which fundamentally altered her sense of safety in the world. She would have described the way the crime had eroded her ability to trust others, a particularly damaging consequence for a professional therapist and social worker, whose career is built upon empathetic engagement. The statement would also have touched upon the violation of her most private space, her home, and the way that sanctuary had been transformed into a place of profound vulnerability. This document was not merely a personal account. It was a piece of evidence, formally entered into the court record, that quantified the human cost of Christopher Thomas's actions and provided the judge with a clear understanding of the long-term damage that required legal redress. The sentencing hearing itself was a solemn and highly structured event. Held in a formal courtroom, it followed a strict procedural order. The judge would have begun by confirming that all parties had received and reviewed the pre-sentence investigation report. The prosecuting attorney then presented their argument for a substantial sentence, likely at the upper end of the state's sentencing guidelines for kidnapping. The prosecutor would have systematically recounted the aggravating factors of the case, the extensive premeditation demonstrated by the construction of the bunker, the use of a weapon and restraints, the terror inflicted over many hours, and the profound documented psychological trauma suffered by the victim, as detailed in her impact statement. The defense attorney, in response, would have made their case for a more lenient sentence, perhaps highlighting Thomas's lack of a prior violent criminal record and his eventual acceptance of responsibility through the guilty plea, arguing that these factors suggested some potential for rehabilitation. After both sides had presented their arguments, Christopher Thomas would have been given the opportunity to make a statement to the court, an opportunity he could accept or decline. Finally, before pronouncing the sentence, the judge would have addressed the defendant, likely summarizing the gravity of the crime and the court's reasoning for the impending judgment, referencing both the cold facts of the PSI and the profound harm described in the victim's statement. The resolution of the legal case, culminating in a prison sentence of 19 to 35 years for Christopher Thomas, provided a formal conclusion to the criminal justice process. However, it simultaneously opened up a broader, more public discourse concerning the psychological underpinnings of the crime and the societal responses to stalking and violence against women. The case of Samantha Stites, due to its extreme nature and the survival of the victim, became a focal point for media analysis, psychological commentary, and advocacy efforts aimed at reforming legal and social systems. The narrative transitioned from the procedural domain of the courtroom to the more interpretive realm of public understanding. Psychological experts, upon reviewing the publicly available details of the case, offered analyses of the offender's profile. Christopher Thomas's behavior was widely identified as consistent with a severe obsessional fixation, a form of erotomania or Declarambot syndrome, where an individual harbors a delusional belief that another person is in love with them, despite clear evidence to the contrary. His actions transcended typical stalking behavior, evolving into a meticulous long-term project of surveillance and, ultimately, violent possession. The construction of the soundproof bunker was not merely a tool for a crime but a physical manifestation of his fantasia-controlled environment where he could exert absolute power over the object of his obsession, free from external interference. His reference to the television show You was seen not as a direct cause, but as a cultural script that may have provided a framework or validation for his pre-existing violent ideas. This detail highlighted a contemporary concern about the ways in which fictional narratives can be co-opted and distorted by individuals with pathological tendencies. The public response to Samantha's story was overwhelmingly one of support and admiration for her resilience and intellect. Her ability to utilize her professional training as a therapist to negotiate with her captor was a central and compelling element of the narrative. It subverted the common trope of the passive victim, instead presenting a portrait of a woman who actively participated in her own survival through psychological acuity. Her story became a case study in crisis negotiation and mental fortitude. Discussed in forums ranging from true crime podcasts to academic journals on victimology, she was lauded not only for surviving the physical ordeal, but for her subsequent decision to speak publicly about her experience, a choice that required a different but equally profound form of courage. By sharing her story, Samantha became an advocate for other victims of stalking. Her experience laid bare the systemic failures that often precede such violent escalation. Her initial difficulty in obtaining a renewed personal protection order, due to the procedural requirement of a joint court appearance, was cited as a critical flaw in a system designed to protect potential victims. The court's denial of an ex parte order, which forced her to choose between facing her stalker in court and foregoing legal protection, exemplified the kind of institutional barrier that can deter victims from seeking help. Her case became a catalyst for discussions among lawmakers, law enforcement agencies, and advocacy groups about the need for more robust and responsive legal mechanisms for dealing with stalking. The argument was made that the legal system needed to better recognize stalking not as a nuisance or a dysfunctional, romantic pursuit, but as a clear and predictive indicator of future violence. The media coverage itself played a significant role in shaping the public's understanding. Documentaries and news programs, such as Stalking Samantha, 13 Years of Terror, provided a platform for Samantha to control her own narrative. These productions combined her direct testimony with interviews with law enforcement officers, archival footage, and recreations of the events. While such programs can sometimes veer into sensationalism, in this case, the focus remained largely on Samantha's perspective and the systemic issues her ordeal highlighted. The visual evidence of the bunker, the police interrogation tapes showing Thomas's detached and self-serving lies, and the calm, articulate manner in which Samantha recounted the events, created a powerful and comprehensive account that resonated with a wide audience. Her story served as a stark and cautionary tale about the importance of taking threats of stalking seriously and the reality that such obsessive behavior can exist behind a facade of social awkwardness or apparent normalcy. The public conversation that ensued contributed to a broader cultural shift in understanding the dynamics of stalking and the imperative of believing and protecting victims. The public narrative and the psychological analyses of the case, while essential for societal understanding and contextualization, were ultimately built upon a foundation of cold, empirical evidence. The successful prosecution of Christopher Thomas was not contingent on the horror of the narrative, but on the meticulous collection, preservation, and analysis of the forensic evidence that physically and digitally tethered him to the crime. The investigation unfolded as a two-pronged effort, meticulously tracing both the tangible residues left at the crime scenes and the intangible, yet equally incriminating, data trails he had generated over years of obsessive surveillance. This body of evidence provided an objective, non-refutable counterpart to the victim's testimony, creating a legal case so formidable that it ultimately precluded the need for a trial. The primary physical crime scene. The storage unit was a treasure trove for forensic investigators. The purpose-built bunker within was, in itself, Exhibit A in the case for premeditation. Its construction was not haphazard. It was a deliberate and methodical project. Forensic examination of the structure would have involved deconstruction to analyze the materials and techniques used, The layers of soundproofing foam, the sturdy wood framing, and the secure door were all catalogued. The points where chains were anchored to the walls were examined for tool marks and structural integrity, providing insight into the intended level of restraint. The interior of the bunker was subjected to a painstaking search for trace evidence. This process, often conducted with alternate light sources to reveal latent prints or biological fluids, would have been followed by the careful collection of any potential evidence using sterile swabs and collection kits. Fibers from clothing, strands of hair, and other microscopic debris would have been collected and packaged for laboratory analysis. The sheets found on the small bed inside the bunker, which were later matched to those found in Thomas's apartment, provided a direct physical link between his residence and the abduction site. Asterisk, the second physical location. Christopher Thomas's apartment served to corroborate the findings from the bunker. The discovery of the ball gag and duct tape, items identical in nature to those described by Samantha, solidified the connection. These were not generic items. Their presence in his personal domain, coupled with the victim's specific testimony, made them deeply incriminating. Forensic analysis would have been performed on these items as well. The duct tape, for instance, could be examined for trace evidence from Samantha's person, or even for latent fingerprints on the non-adhesive side. Every item seized from his apartment was logged into an evidence tracking system, establishing a clear and unbroken chain of custody from the point of collection to its presentation in court, a procedural necessity to ensure the admissibility of the evidence. Samantha's vehicle was also a crucial piece of the forensic puzzle. It was processed as a separate crime scene, as it was the means of transport between her home, the storage unit, and the parking lot. The interior would have been meticulously vacuumed for trace evidence, and all surfaces would have been tested for fingerprints and DNA, creating a forensic map of who was in the car and where they were positioned. Asterisk. Parallel to the collection of physical evidence was the equally critical task of reconstructing the digital ghost of Christopher Thomas's stalking campaign. The investigation into his electronic devices and data history revealed the true extent and duration of his surveillance. The key to his ability to manifest in Samantha's life with such unnerving frequency was his use of global positioning system tracking devices. Investigators, upon securing his electronic equipment through a search warrant, would have found records of these devices. Analysis of the data logs from the trackers placed on the vehicles of Samantha and her friends would have produced a detailed minute-by-minute history of their movements over an extended period. This data, consisting of timestamps, geographic coordinates, vehicle speed, and the duration of stops, provided a digital diary of his stalking. It would have shown, for example, a tracker-equipped vehicle arriving at a grocery store, followed minutes later by data from Thomas's own phone showing him arriving at the same location. This digital correlation transformed what might have been dismissed as a series of coincidences into a documented pattern of predatory behavior, asterisk, beyond the trackers. Investigators would have sought court orders to obtain records from telecommunication companies and social media platforms. These records would have provided a comprehensive history of his attempts to contact Samantha, including the text messages and Facebook messages she had blocked. Even if deleted from his devices, these communications often remain on company servers and are retrievable with the proper legal authority. This data would formally document the one-sided nature of the communication, his persistence in the face of her repeated rejections, and the increasingly obsessive tone of his messages. His online search history, recovered from his computers and phone, may also have provided insights into his planning, potentially including searches for soundproofing materials, methods of restraint, or even the location of the storage facility. The combination of this digital evidence created a timeline that stretched back years, proving that the abduction was not an isolated event, but the violent culmination of a long and calculated campaign of psychological terror, all of which was now preserved in data logs and server records, forming an undeniable and permanent digital footprint. Asterisk. The conviction and sentencing of Christopher Thomas provided a measure of justice for Samantha Stites. Yet her 13-year ordeal also served as a critical and public case study of the institutional frameworks designed to prevent such outcomes and their inherent limitations. The narrative of her experience is not solely one of an individual predator and a resilient victim. It is also a story about systems, procedures, and the points at which they failed to provide an adequate shield. An examination of the legal and law enforcement mechanisms that were engaged, or that failed to be engaged, reveals the significant challenges that victims of stalking face when attempting to leverage institutional power for their own protection. The case highlighted the critical gap that can exist between the lived reality of a victim's fear and the formal burden of proof required by the legal system. Asterisk. The primary legal tool available to individuals in Samantha's position is the Personal Protection Order, or PPO, a civil court order designed to prohibit a specific individual from contacting or approaching another. The initial PPO that Samantha obtained after 3 years of harassment was a textbook application of this legal remedy. It provided a temporary period of state-enforced separation, carrying with it the threat of arrest for any violation. For 6 years, this instrument appeared to be effective, primarily because it was coupled with a significant geographic distance after Samantha relocated. However, the system's limitations became starkly apparent when the stalking resumed and she sought to renew the order. The court's denial of an ex parte renewal, which would have granted a temporary order based on her testimony alone pending a full hearing, was a critical failure point. Asterisk. This procedural decision was likely not born of malice or disbelief, but of a strict adherence to legal standards that require a high threshold of evidence for granting an order without the respondent present. The court's requirement that she appear at a formal hearing, which Christopher Thomas would also attend, placed her in an untenable and dangerous position. For a victim of long-term stalking, the act of confronting the perpetrator in a formal setting, particularly to argue that he is a threat, carries the risk of significant escalation. There is the fear that if the order is not granted, the stalker will be emboldened. Conversely, even if the order is granted, the act of bringing him to court could be perceived as a challenge, triggering a retaliatory response. Samantha's decision to abandon the PPO renewal was not a sign of surrender, but a calculated risk assessment, in which she determined that the potential danger of agitating her stalker through a court appearance outweighed the potential benefit of a piece of paper that he had already proven willing to ignore in spirit, if not in letter. This illustrates a fundamental dilemma in the protection order system. It is a legal tool that, in some circumstances, requires the victim to assume a level of personal risk that the system itself cannot fully mitigate. Asterisk. The response of law enforcement to stalking is another critical institutional dimension. Stalking is a notoriously difficult crime to investigate and prosecute. It is a crime of patterns. A single text message, a lone appearance at a public park, or a bouquet of flowers left on a car are not, in isolation, criminal acts. The criminality emerges from the context, the repetition, and the fear they engender in the victim. Police departments, often dealing with limited resources and prioritizing response to overt acts of violence, can struggle to build a criminal case based on a series of seemingly minor, non-violent incidents. Effective stalking investigation requires specialized training to recognize behavioral patterns, an understanding of the psychology of obsession, and a commitment to meticulous documentation over time. Asterisk. In Samantha's case, while she did engage with the legal system to get the first The day-to-day management of the stalking in the years that followed was largely a burden she and her friends shouldered alone. They were the ones searching her car for trackers and developing safety plans. It was only after the commission of a violent felony, the kidnapping and assault, that the full resources of the law enforcement and judicial systems were brought to bear with decisive force. This reactive, rather than proactive, posture is a common criticism of the institutional response to stalking. Advocacy groups argue that if the initial patterns of stalking had been investigated with the same seriousness as a direct physical threat, the eventual escalation to violence might have been averted. The case of Samantha Stites serves as a powerful argument for a paradigm shift, urging the legal and law enforcement communities to view stalking not as a relational dispute, but as a direct and often predictable precursor to severe violence, demanding a more robust and preemptive institutional response. The institutional failures that permitted a 13-year campaign of stalking to culminate in a violent abduction are abstract, existing within the realms of legal procedure and bureaucratic inertia. However, the planning undertaken by Christopher Thomas was starkly concrete. An in-depth examination of the crime's physical centerpiece, the soundproofed bunker, reveals a level of premeditation and logistical effort that transcends the typical profile of a violent offender. The storage unit was not merely a convenient location. It was a carefully selected and meticulously modified architectural space, engineered for the specific purpose of long-term human captivity. The analysis of this structure provides a chillingly clear schematic of the offender's intentions, articulated not in words, but in lumber, foam, and steel. The selection of a self-storage facility, as the venue was, in itself, a strategic decision demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of modern anonymity. Such facilities are characterized by a high degree of privacy and a low level of routine oversight. Clients are provided with access codes, allowing them to come and go at all hours without direct interaction with staff. The transient nature of the clientele and the sheer volume of units create an environment where unusual activity, such as the transport of building materials over an extended period, is unlikely to attract notice. Thomas's rental of a unit provided him with a private, securable space, functionally an off-site workshop, where he could execute his construction project without raising suspicion. The monthly rental agreement was a low-risk investment in the infrastructure of his planned crime. The construction of the bunker within the standard 10-foot-by-10-foot or 10-foot-by-20-foot metal box of the storage unit was a project of significant complexity. It required a systematic process of design, material acquisition, and assembly. The primary engineering challenge was acoustic isolation, to render the screams and struggles of a captive inaudible to anyone who might be in an adjacent unit or the corridor outside. A nested room or room within a room design was employed. This involved building a freestanding interior structure with its own walls and ceiling, deliberately leaving a gap between the new construction and the existing metal walls of the storage unit. This air gap is a fundamental principle of soundproofing, serving to decouple the inner room from the outer shell and disrupt the transmission of sound vibrations. The acquisition of materials for this project would have required careful planning to avoid creating a suspicious evidentiary trail. It is probable that Thomas made numerous trips to multiple home improvement stores, purchasing materials in smaller quantities to avoid drawing attention from retail staff. Cash transactions would have been the preferred method to prevent the creation of a clear financial record linking him to the purchase of large amounts of lumber, drywall, and acoustic insulation. The sheer volume of material required for the project, including 2x4 studs for framing, sheets of drywall or plywood for the walls, and, most critically, thick layers of sound-absorbing foam or insulation, represented a significant logistical undertaking. These materials had to be transported to the storage facility, likely under the cover of darkness or during off-peak hours, and moved from his vehicle into the unit without being observed. The assembly process itself would have taken a considerable amount of time and a degree of construction skill. He would have needed to transport a set of tools to the site, including saws, drills, and fastening equipment. The construction of the frame, the installation of the wall panels, and the meticulous application of the soundproofing material layer by layer would have been a labor-intensive process, likely carried out over many weeks or even months. The disposal of construction debris and packaging would have been another logistical hurdle, requiring him to remove waste from the site in small, non-suspicious quantities. The interior of the bunker was furnished with a chillingly specific purpose. The inclusion of a small bed or mattress indicates an intention for a prolonged stay. The most damning features, however, were the hard anchor points installed in the walls. The chains found by police were not an afterthought. Their mounting points would have been integrated into the bunker's frame structure, ensuring they were secured to load-bearing studs capable of withstanding the full force of a struggling adult. The selection and placement of these restraints speak to a detailed fantasy that included the complete physical domination and immobilization of his victim. The absence of other amenities, such as a permanent toilet or running water, suggests that he had a plan for managing these basic human needs that likely involved further controlling and degrading interactions with his captive. The structure, therefore, was not merely a location, but a purpose-built environment engineered to facilitate a specific and violent long-term fantasy. The final pronouncement of a prison sentence marks the end of the state's direct legal engagement with a crime, but it is often the beginning of a different, more enduring chapter for the survivor. For Samantha Stites, the incarceration of her tormentor provided a necessary precondition for safety, but it did not erase the 13 years of escalating terror or the profound trauma of the abduction. The aftermath of such an ordeal is not a simple return to a previous state of being, but a complex and ongoing process of constructing a new normal. This process involves intensive personal therapeutic work, the recalibration of one's relationship with the world, and, in Samantha's case, the transformation of her personal trauma into a powerful public narrative for advocacy and change. The diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, as mentioned in her victim impact statement, is a clinical acknowledgement of the deep and lasting neurological impact of the events. This is not a psychological weakness, but a physiological response to an overwhelming threat to one's life and autonomy. The symptoms she described: hypervigilance, difficulty sleeping, a fear of being alienable, the brain's and nervous system's attempts to prevent such a threat from ever occurring again. They represent a state of constant, exhausting alert. The therapeutic process for managing PTSD is arduous. It often involves modalities such as cognitive behavioral therapy, which helps to reframe the intrusive thoughts and cognitive distortions that arise from trauma, and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing (EM), a technique designed to help the brain process and store traumatic memories in a less disruptive way. Through this difficult work, the goal is not to forget what happened, but to reduce the power of the traumatic memories to trigger an acute stress response in the present. This allows for a gradual reclaiming of a sense of safety and control. Samantha's professional background as a therapist provided her with a unique cognitive toolkit to navigate both the crisis itself and its aftermath. Her ability to compartmentalize and think strategically during the abduction was a testament to her training. In the recovery phase, the same understanding of human psychology would have informed her own healing process. However, it also presented a unique challenge: the very skills of empathy and trust that are central to her profession. were the ones most profoundly damaged by the violation she endured. Rebuilding her capacity to be a therapist while simultaneously being a patient in her own recovery journey represents a difficult and delicate balance. Her choice to return to a profession dedicated to helping others navigate their own traumas is, in itself, an act of profound resilience, beyond her personal recovery. Samantha made the deliberate choice to step into the public sphere and share her story. This decision fundamentally reappropriated her narrative. In the hands of her attacker, her life story was the subject of a possessive, violent fantasy. In the hands of the media and the courts, it became a case file, a collection of evidence and testimony. By speaking out on her own terms, in documentaries and interviews, she seized control of the story, transforming it from something that happened to her into something she could use. This act of public testimony serves multiple purposes. It is a form of advocacy, shining a bright light on the systemic failures of the legal system in addressing stalking and providing a powerful, humanizing argument for reform. Her story becomes a teaching tool for law enforcement, social workers, and the general public, illustrating the warning signs of obsessive behavior and the critical importance of taking such threats seriously. Furthermore, by telling her story, she provides a voice and a sense of solidarity for countless other victims who may not have the platform or the capacity to speak for themselves. She demonstrates that survival is possible and that a life of purpose and meaning can be built even in the shadow of immense trauma. Her journey challenges the simplistic cultural narratives of victims. She is not defined by what was done to her, but by how she responded, how she survived, and how she chose to move forward. This deliberate construction of a post-traumatic identity, one that incorporates the experience without being wholly consumed by it, is the essence of her new normal. Her life, irrevocably altered, continues not as a damaged version of what came before, but as a new and powerful testament to the capacity of the human spirit to endure, to heal, and to create meaning from chaos. Human nature always seeks answers. We try to illuminate every clue, every whisper, every dark corner. However, the fact that some questions remain unanswered is, in fact, the most accurate answer. See you in the next unsolved case.